Hey, welcome back to our AEC Midweek Bible Studies. Grace and peace to you from God our Father and from our Lord Jesus Christ. Happy New Year and Merry Christmas. Today is January 6th, and in the Armenian tradition, January 6th is our Armenian Christmas. And so I'll say to you, Christos Tsenav, Yevhait Netzav, Tsezi Mezi Meds Avedis. The Christ is born and revealed to you and to us good news, hope has broken into the world in the birth of the Christ child. And so we celebrate that on January 6th and every day of the year as we reflect on the good news of the grace of God. If you've been with us this past couple of weeks, you'll remember that we've been in the Gospel of John. We've been specifically in one section of John's Gospel we call the Upper Room Discourse. And this is a moment where Jesus sits with his disciples and gives them his last will and testament. He's about to depart from them. He's about to leave them. He's going to go to the cross. So, first he'll be arrested. He'll go on trial, and then he's going to go to the cross, be crucified, rise again, and ascend to the Father. So he is leaving them, but he wants to assure them that he's not abandoning them, he's not orphaning them, but that instead he's preparing a way for them and others to follow. And so this little session, this teaching session, at the dinner table is a moment where Jesus gives comfort and cares for the disciples and gives them a framework or a way to understand and conceptualize what he's doing and how they ought to live with Jesus leaving. We've spent time in each chapter of this section, so it starts in chapter 13 and it's closing in chapter 17. So if you've been with us on the journey, you'll know how that all progresses. But just quickly to summarize, chapter 13 is sort of the introduction. It begins this session, and there's some powerful moments that begin the teaching session, where Jesus washes the disciples' feet and gives of himself, takes on the role of the servant to anticipate the cross and what's about to happen to him. Chapter 14, there's the metaphor of home language, of spatial language, where Jesus tells the disciples what he's about to do in his departure is preparing a space for the disciples and for mankind to intimately connect with God, to enter into God's presence, to be dwellers, I guess, to be visitors, or to make themselves at home, that's a better way to say it, with God. And his departure is to prepare that space where they can intimately connect with God and God's space. So where human space and God's space can sort of interconnect. Chapter 15, Jesus switches the metaphor, and it's now the image of a vine and branches. And so the whole scene there, Jesus in chapter 15 is telling the disciples that with his departure, he wants them to connect with him. He wants them to remain in him, to attach themselves to his way, his life, so that they can grow, nourish, and bear fruit. In chapter 16, Jesus kind of wraps it up, brings everything to a close. The themes kind of circle around hostility that they may meet as they enter into the world now and continue Jesus' mission. And now in chapter 17, where we are, we were there last week, and now we're closing up this week. Jesus wraps everything up with a prayer. Some people call this the high priestly prayer in John's Gospel. And in chapter 17, conveniently for teaching purposes, the prayer very easily breaks up into three parts. Jesus begins with a prayer that reflects his intimate relationship with the Father, so it's more focused on him and the Father and what his work is about to do. And then, that's what we covered last week. And then in these coming 2 weeks, in this week, in the coming two sections, Jesus will pray first off for the disciples gathered there, the 12, minus Judas. And then he'll pray for all disciples, all disciples who are to come, generations down the line. He anticipates his movement going on beyond his time and the disciples' time and out into the future in perpetuity. So it's fascinating to think. It's something that I encourage you to do as you read the text today, to read the last part of the prayer, verses 20 to 24 of chapter 17, to read that as a prayer for you and for me and for us as a church. It's pretty fascinating and powerful to read that closing prayer as a prayer for us as disciples, specifically for us as disciples, generations removed from those first disciples, from the apostles. What I want to do is just kind of break down those last two parts of the prayer today. And we're going to close off chapter 17 and close off the upper room discourse. And next week, we're going to shift into a different scripture text. We're going to come out of John for a while and spend time in another book. But I want to take a look at the last two parts of the prayer, chapter 17, 9 to 19, and chapter 17, 20 to 24. So, like I said, in chapter 17, 9 to 19, Jesus is praying specifically for his disciples. In fact, he says, I'm not praying for the world, I'm not praying for anybody else right now, I'm praying for the people in the room right here. And I'm praying for them specifically because I want them to be safe. That's one of the themes here in this part of the prayer for the disciples. He prays that the disciples would be protected and that they would be safe. He recognizes that they will share in many ways the fate that Jesus will meet in just a few moments and a few scenes. He recognizes that the life of following Jesus can invite hostility from injustice, from evil, from what John calls the world. And so he prays for their safety. He prays that they would be protected and cared for, and that they would find rest in the midst of a hostile world. He also prays that they would share in his joy. Now, if you take a look at what Jesus means by that throughout the Gospel of John, the joy of Jesus is to do the work of the Father. Jesus celebrates the joy of being able to participate in what God is doing and to be able to bring about the glory of God's new creation, his new work, his redeeming of the world. And so Jesus is actually praying that the disciples would share in this joy. In other words, to share in this rich work of participating in what God is up to in the world. And so throughout this part of the prayer for the disciples at the meal, at the table, he is inviting the disciples and he's praying that God would empower the disciples to actually carry out this mission. It's not something they can do on their own, and it's not something that Jesus excuses them from doing. It's something that Jesus says is they're called to do, but he asks God to empower them to participate in this work and participate in the mission of Jesus. And so right there, you'll get a sense when you read the text that what Jesus has for his disciples is meant to be carried out into the future. The life of following Jesus is not a life of just sitting around and reflecting on things. It's acting, it's being a part of the movement in the world. And Jesus prays that they would be empowered to do just that here in this first part of the prayer in the section that we're reading today, verses 9 to 19. Then, secondly, in verses 20 to 24, Jesus prays for disciples' generations to come. So he's praying for you and me, like I said. And his prayer is that they would be, that the generations of Christians to come would be one. That they would be one. Now, this has been interpreted in many different ways. There's, a simple way to say that he wants us all to get along, right? And so that's part of what he means when he says that he prays for all of us to be one. But there's something more nuanced and more insightful and powerful about Jesus' prayer for the generations of Jesus followers to be one. And it has to do with the generations of Jesus' followers to come to be connected and singular in their voice against the world. So in John's gospel, there's the world and then there's the people who follow Jesus. And the world is, we've talked about it, the world of decay and rebellion and injustice and hatred, just darkness. Everything that's just gross about the world around us, that's the world in John's mind. And so John sees things very clear cut. There's Jesus' followers and there's the world. And his prayer that they be one and the generations of Christians after him would be one is that generations of Christians to come after would align themselves with that voice that sees the world as broken and corrupted. That for Jesus to say he wants his disciples to be one is to say that all of the future disciples would be connected to Jesus's ministry and to Jesus's followers, and in such a way pose a singular threat to the brokenness and hopelessness of the world. That's the unity Jesus is looking for. Not just a let's all get along and hug. It's part of it. But it's to gather together with one voice in solidarity against a world that is decaying and broken and in need of hope. And there's also a prayer in this section for the generations of Christians to come to participate in Jesus' mission, just like the prayer for the disciples there gathered in the room. And he says that he prays, and this is right in the text, that the disciples, that those who follow him down the line, would be with me. That's what he says. I pray that they would be with me. And so his prayer for you and I and this church is that we would be with him, that we would follow him, and that we would participate in what he's doing here now, even though we're generations and hundreds of years removed, thousands of years removed from his original ministry. And so it's powerful. This section here is a prayer that conceptualizes who we are as a part of this movement that started 2,000 years ago. And it's as if, especially this last section, verses 20 to 24, it jumps out of the pages and says, hey, here's Jesus praying for us to be one and to be with him and to participate in this mission that he started 2,000 years ago today that brings hope and new creation into the world. And so this Armenian Christmas, this moment where we pause and celebrate the revelation of God among us in his Son, is a moment for us to pause and reflect on what it means for us to participate in the new thing that God was doing then and is doing now in his Son, Jesus Christ. So again, Merry Christmas to you. And I look forward to meeting with you next week. There will be the study guide down below you can interact with and use that in your own time. But I hope that you find these meaningful and useful for your spiritual walk and Christian journey. And we'll be back together next week in a different text. We won't be in John's Gospel anymore. We're going to pivot out of it for a little bit. And maybe we'll come back during Easter to John's Passion. But for now, we're going to spend some time elsewhere. And I'm looking forward to connecting with you next week. God bless and be with you.